All right, diving into some serious cellular machinery today, huh? Insulin and IGF receptors. You've sent over some fascinating research on these things. The tiny gatekeepers that control our body's energy and metabolism and even growth.
Yeah, it really is a complex system, but once you sort of get how these receptors work, it's pretty amazing.
Uh,
You get a real appreciation for this whole dance of hormones and energy keeps our bodies going.
yeah, for sure. And from what I've been reading, it seems like you're pretty interested in the nuts and bolts, right? How these receptors work and what happens when things get messed up and maybe how we can target them for treatment.
You hit the nail on the head, and we're talking about some serious consequences of dysregulation here. Diabetes, cancer, the whole nine yards.
Okay, well, let's start with the basics then. These receptors are like a type of enzyme, right? Something with tyrosine kinases.
Exactly, yeah. They're called receptor tyrosine kinases, or RTKs for short. You can think of them like little molecular switches on the surface of cells. When a signal comes along, like insulin or IGF, and binds to the receptor, it flips that switch. And that sets off this whole cascade of events inside the cell.
So it's kind of like a domino effect, huh? One thing leads to the next.
Precisely. And a crucial part of this domino effect are these fascinating proteins called IRS proteins. Insulin receptor substrates, that is.
Okay, so those are like the VIPs of the operation, the ones really making things happen.
Yeah, you could say that. You see, once the receptor is activated, it phosphorylates these IRS proteins, and they then act as docking sites for other signaling molecules. They're like the receptor's entourage, basically relaying messages and coordinating the whole cellular response.
All right, I think I'm starting to get the picture here. So insulin or IGF binds to the receptor activates its entourage, the IRS proteins. And then what? What's the end goal of all this signaling?
Well, one of the most important functions of the insulin IGF pathway is to regulate glucose uptake. Glucose is like the fuel that powers our cells, right? And these receptors control how much of that fuel gets in.
Ah, so if these receptors aren't working the way they should be, that could lead to some problems with blood sugar control, like we see in diabetes.
Exactly. In type 2 diabetes, for instance, the cells become resistant to insulin. It's like the receptor is getting the signal, but it's not really responding the way it should. And this leads to high blood sugar, which can damage all sorts of organs over time.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does this receptor actually control glucose uptake? Does it act like a gate, letting glucose in?
It's a little more indirect than that. What happens is the binding of insulin to its receptor, it triggers the movement of glucose transporters to the cell's surface.
So it's more like sending out an order to open up more entry points for glucose.
Exactly. You see, these glucose transporters, they're like specialized doorways.
Yeah.
They allow glucose to enter the cell. And the insulin receptor, by increasing their numbers on the cell surface, it basically boosts the cell's ability to take up glucose.
Fascinating. So it's not just about opening a gate; it's about like building more gates to let in the influx of glucose.
You got it. And there are actually different types of these glucose transporters, too, each with its own role and location in the body. GLUT4, for example, is a major player in muscle and fat cells.
Okay, so different cells have their own specialized glucose uptake machinery. Makes sense.
Absolutely. And that specialization is crucial for maintaining this balance, this glucose homeostasis in the body.
So we've talked about how the insulin IGF receptor regulates glucose uptake. Are there other functions that these receptors are involved in?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Besides regulating glucose uptake, the insulin IGF pathway, it also has this crucial role in stimulating anabolic processes.
Anabolic processes. Now remind me what that means again.
Think of it like the building and growth phase of metabolism. These pathways are responsible for, synthesizing proteins, building muscle, storing energy, essentially all the processes that help us grow and thrive.
Gotcha. So insulin and IGF, they're not just about controlling blood sugar. They're involved in like building up the body too.
Exactly. They're like the master architects of growth and development.
Okay, well, how does the activation of these receptors actually switch on those building pathways then?
Well, it triggers a series of signaling cascades. These cascades activate key enzymes that are involved in those anabolic processes. For example, one really crucial enzyme is mTOR, which acts like a central regulator of cell growth and protein synthesis.
So activating the insulin IGF receptor, it sets off this chain reaction, and that ultimately tells the cells to start building and growing.
Exactly. It's like sending out a construction crew, to start building new structures and expanding existing ones. And this growth promoting effect, it's one of the reasons why IGF is so important for childhood development.
Interesting. So these receptors are like the masterminds behind like both energy regulation and growth. That's a lot of responsibility for such a tiny molecule.
Absolutely. And that's why dysregulation of this pathway can have such widespread consequences, you know?
Yeah, you mentioned diabetes earlier. Are there other health problems that are linked to dysfunction in this pathway?
Yeah, unfortunately. When you start to, dig into the research, you'll see a clear link between dysregulation of the insulin IGF pathway and cancer.
Oh wow, that's serious. How so?
Well, uncontrolled activation of this pathway, it can lead to uncontrolled cell growth and proliferation. And that's kind of, that's a hallmark of cancer.
So it's like those construction crews we were talking about earlier. They've gone rogue,
Yeah,
just building stuff with no regulation.
that's it exactly. And this uncontrolled growth can lead to, tumors forming and the spread of cancer cells throughout the body.
Man, it's just amazing how such a fundamental pathway can have such diverse effects on our health. It really shows how interconnected all these systems in our body are.
It really does. And it underscores, how important it is to understand these pathways at the molecular level, that is.
Speaking of understanding, I'm curious about those feedback loops that you mentioned earlier. How do those fit into this whole picture?
Ah, right. Feedback loops. They're absolutely crucial for maintaining balance. They stop things from getting out of control.
So they're like the checks and balances of this whole intricate system.
Exactly. You can think of it like a thermostat, right? When a room gets too hot, the thermostat signals the AC to kick in, and that brings the temperature back down. Similarly, in the insulin IGF pathway, there are these negative feedback loops that help keep the signaling in check.
So can you give me like an example of how that actually works?
Sure, one way this happens is through the downregulation of the receptor itself. When the pathway is activated for prolonged periods, the cell can actually decrease the number of receptors on its surface.
So it's like turning down the sensitivity on the thermostat,
Right.
so it doesn't overreact.
That's the idea. And it helps prevent excessive signaling, which can have some pretty harmful effects.
So when these feedback loops break down, that's when we see problems like diabetes and cancer.
You got it. Dysregulation of those feedback loops, it can lead to a state of chronic overactivation of the insulin IGF pathway. And as we've been discussing, that can contribute to a whole bunch of health issues.
Wow. So these feedback loops, they're like the unsung heroes of the cellular world, just keeping everything running smoothly in the background.
They really are. And their importance is often overlooked. It's usually not until things go wrong that people start paying attention.
Yeah, that's true. We've talked about how, dysfunction in this pathway can lead to some pretty serious health problems. But what about solutions? Are there ways to target this pathway for treatment?
That's a great question, and it's an area of very active research. Scientists are working on, developing new therapies that can restore balance to the pathway and prevent those party foul health problems we talked about.
So it's like we're trying to recalibrate those faulty thermostats or repair those broken feedback loops.
Precisely. One approach is to develop drugs that can directly target the receptor itself. For instance, there are insulin analogs, which are used to treat diabetes.
Ah, okay. So these analogs, they're like synthetic versions of insulin. They bind to the receptor and trigger the desired response.
That's right. They're designed to, mimic the action of natural insulin and help regulate those blood sugar levels.
That's pretty credible. So
Yeah.
by understanding like the molecular details of these pathways, we can actually design like targeted therapies to fix what's broken.
That's the power of scientific inquiry, And as we learn more about these intricate pathways, we'll be able to develop even more effective treatments for a whole range of conditions.
This is all so fascinating. It really makes you appreciate the complexity and elegance of, the human body.
It truly does. It really highlights the importance of continued research in this field.
Okay, well we've covered a lot of ground today, but it seems like there's still so much more to explore when it comes to these
Yeah.
these remarkable receptors.
Oh, absolutely. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole world of intricate details and fascinating connections waiting to be uncovered.
Well, I can't wait to get into those details then.
Yeah, let's dive right in. So, ready to go a bit deeper into these signaling cascades that are triggered by these receptors.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see how these dominoes really start falling.
All right. Well, like we touched on earlier, the activation of that insulin IGF receptor, it leads to the phosphorylation of those crucial IRS proteins.
Right, right. The VIP entourage.
Exactly. Now, these phosphorylated IRS proteins, they act like beacons. They attract a whole bunch of other signaling molecules. And one of the key players that gets recruited is this thing called PI3K, or phosphonolactide 3 kinase, if you want the full name.
Okay, another enzyme with a pretty complicated name. What does this PI3K actually do?
Well, it's an enzyme that makes this specific type of lipid molecule. It's called PIP3, which stands for, get this, phosphatidylinositol 3,4,5 trisphosphate.
Okay, I'm going to need to write that one down. So this PIP3, what's so special about it?
Think of PIP3 as like a molecular landing pad. It anchors other signaling proteins to the cell membrane, bringing them close together so they can interact.
Ah, so PI3K is setting the stage for the next act in this signaling play by creating this PIP3 landing pad.
Yeah, precisely. And one of the crucial proteins that's drawn to this landing pad is this protein called AKT, also known as protein kinase B.
Okay, AKT, another kinase. Seems like these things are everywhere in these pathways. What's so important about AKT?
Well, AKT is it's like a master regulator, you know. It regulates cell survival, growth, metabolism, all sorts of things. Once it's activated, it phosphorylates a whole bunch of downstream targets, and that triggers a wide range of cellular responses.
So it's like AKT is the conductor of the orchestra,
Right.
directing all the musicians to play the right notes at the right time.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And the specific notes that AKT plays, well, they depend on, they depend on the type of cell and the signals that it's receiving.
Now, I remember we were talking about MTOR earlier, that enzyme that's involved in cell growth and protein synthesis. Is that one of AKT's targets?
Yes, it is. AKT is a major activator of MTOR. By phosphorylating and activating MTOR, AKT is basically giving the green light for cell growth and proliferation.
So AKT is like giving the construction crew the permits and the funding to start those anabolic projects.
You got it. And this MTOR pathway, it's crucial for all kinds of cellular processes, from muscle growth to immune responses.
We've been talking about this cascade of events like it's a linear pathway, but I'm guessing it's probably a lot more complicated than that, right?
Oh, you're absolutely right. These signaling pathways, they're anything but linear. There are countless, feedback loops, crosstalk mechanisms, all sorts of intricate interactions that make this whole system incredibly, complex and dynamic.
Okay, so it's less like a straight line and more like a big tangled web of interconnected pathways.
That's a good way to visualize it. And one of the biggest challenges for researchers is to try to untangle this web, to try and understand how all these pieces fit together.
I can see why why dysregulation of this pathway can lead to so many problems. If even one of these components goes haywire, it could just throw the whole system off.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to really understand these pathways at the molecular level. That's the key to developing targeted therapies.
Speaking of targeted therapies, we briefly touched on insulin analogs earlier. Are there other drugs that target this pathway?
Oh, yeah. There are. Researchers are developing new drugs that target different components of this pathway, including PI3K and AKT.
So it's like having different strategies to fix a broken machine, right? You can either replace a faulty part, like with those insulin analogs, or you can try and repair the existing parts, like with PI3K or AKT inhibitors.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And these targeted therapies, they hold a lot of promise for treating a whole bunch of conditions, from diabetes to cancer.
You mentioned earlier that there's a lot of crosstalk between these signaling pathways.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean? Are these pathways like talking to each other?
It's not, it's not exactly like they're having a conversation or anything, but they do, they do influence each other in some pretty subtle and complex ways. You see, cells don't just have, they don't just have one signaling pathway operating in isolation. There are multiple pathways working at the same time, and those pathways can, they can intersect and interact in all sorts of ways.
So it's less like separate phone lines and more like a big bustling network where signals are constantly being relayed and rerouted.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. For example, the insulin IGF pathway, it can crosstalk with other pathways that regulate cell growth, or stress responses, even inflammation.
Okay, so it's not just about understanding one pathway by itself. It's about understanding the whole interconnected network.
That's the key, and that's one of the one of the things that makes studying these pathways so challenging. They're just so interconnected that it can be really difficult to isolate the effects of one pathway from another.
Now, I'm curious about the role of, the role of genetics in all this.
Uh,
Do our genes actually influence how these pathways operate?
Oh, absolutely. Our genes provide the blueprint, you could say, for all the proteins involved in these pathways. And variations in these genes, well, they can influence how those proteins function. And that can ultimately affect our susceptibility to diseases, like diabetes and cancer.
So it's like having different versions of the software, right? The software that runs the cellular program.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And those genetic variations can help explain why some people are more prone to certain diseases than others.
It's also, it's fascinating, but I got to admit, it's a lot to take in. It's like trying to map out the entire circuitry of this incredibly complex machine.
I know it can be a bit overwhelming, but it's also incredibly exciting. The more we learn about these intricate pathways, the closer we get to really understanding the fundamental mechanisms of life.
Okay, so we've covered the basics of insulin IGF receptor signaling, but I know there's still so much more to explore. What else can you tell me about these remarkable receptors?
Well, one area of active research is focusing on the specific roles of different isoforms of these receptors. Remember how we talked about the different types of glucose transporters? Well, it turns out that the insulin IGF receptors themselves, they can actually exist in different forms too, and those forms are called isoforms, and they can have slightly different functions.
Okay, isoforms. Remind me what that means again.
Think of it like having different versions of the same software program. The basic code is the same, but there are these little modifications, modifications that can alter how the program performs. Similarly, different isoforms of the insulin IGF receptor, they arise from alternative splicing of the gene that encodes it.
So it's like having different versions of the receptor, each with its own unique set of features.
Exactly. And these different isoforms, they can have subtle but important effects on how the receptor functions. For example, some isoforms might be, more sensitive to insulin or IGF, while others might have different binding affinities for downstream signaling molecules.
So it's not just about the receptor itself. It's also about the specific version of the receptor that's being expressed.
Precisely. And this adds another layer of complexity to the whole system. Researchers are still trying to really understand the roles of these different isoforms and how they contribute to the overall regulation of the pathway.
Okay, so there's more to these receptors than just their basic structure and function.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes this field so fascinating. There are always new discoveries being made. Our understanding of these pathways is constantly evolving.
Mhm. Now we've been focusing on the insulin IGF receptor itself, but I'm curious about the other proteins that interact with it. You mentioned those IRS proteins earlier, but are there other key players that can influence how the receptor functions?
Yeah, definitely. There's a whole host of proteins that can interact with the insulin IGF receptor, either directly or indirectly, and that can modulate its activity.
So it's like a complex social network, right? A social network of proteins all influencing each other's behavior.
That's a great analogy. And those interacting proteins, they can play a whole bunch of different roles, from enhancing receptor signaling to dampening it down.
Can you give me an example of a protein that enhances receptor signaling?
Sure. One example is this protein called GERB2, which stands for growth factor receptor bound protein 2. And this protein, it binds to the activated insulin IGF receptor, and it helps recruit other signaling molecules like SOS, which ultimately activates the RAS-MAP PK pathway.
Okay, another pathway with a pretty complicated name. What's the RAS-MAP PK pathway all about?
The RASMAP pathway is it's a major signaling pathway that regulates cell growth, proliferation, and differentiation. It's like it's like a parallel pathway to that PI3K AKT pathway we were talking about earlier, and it's also activated by the insulin IGF receptor.
So it's like having, it's like having two different construction crews working on the same project, but each specializing in different aspects of the build.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And this activation of multiple pathways, it allows for a more diverse and coordinated cellular response.
You mentioned that some proteins can actually dampen down receptor signaling. Can can you give me an example of that?
Sure. One example is this protein called PTNN, which stands for phosphatase and tensin homolog. This protein, it acts as a phosphatase, which means it removes phosphate groups from other molecules, and one of its targets is PIP3, that molecular landing pad we were talking about earlier.
Ah, so PTN essentially disassembles the landing pad that PI3K created.
Exactly. By dephosphorylating PIP3, PTNN inhibits the recruitment of AKT to the cell membrane, and that effectively puts the brakes on that PI3K AKT pathway.
So it's like PTN is it's like PTN is the safety inspector. It's shutting down the construction project if it seems too risky.
That's a great analogy, and this inhibitory role of PTM, it's really crucial for preventing uncontrolled cell growth and tumor formation.
Seems like we've uncovered a whole cast of characters here, all interacting with the insulin IGF receptor. Are there any overarching principles that govern these interactions?
Oh yeah, definitely. One key principle is specificity. Each protein that's involved in these pathways, it has a specific binding site. A specific binding site for its interacting partner, and that ensures that the right signals are transmitted at the right time.
So it's like a complex puzzle, right? Where each piece fits together in just the right way.
Exactly, and that specificity is crucial for maintaining the fidelity of signaling and for preventing crosstalk between unrelated pathways.
Another principle you mentioned earlier was feedback regulation. Can you kind of elaborate on how that applies to these interacting proteins?
Sure. So feedback regulation, it's essential for fine-tuning the sensitivity and duration of signaling. For example, some of the proteins that are activated by the insulin IGF receptor, they can actually turn around and inhibit upstream components of the pathway, and that creates a negative feedback loop.
So it's a self-regulating system. The output can obviously influence the input to maintain a steady state.
That's right. And this feedback regulation, it helps prevent overactivation of the pathway, and that ensures a balanced response.
Okay, I think I'm starting to grasp the complexity and sophistication of these receptor interactions. It's like a finely tuned machine. Yeah. With multiple checks and balances to ensure smooth and efficient operation.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's really a testament to the elegance and efficiency of evolution.
We've been focusing on the intracellular events, the events that are triggered by the insulin IGF receptor. But I'm kind of curious about what happens to the receptor itself after it's activated. Does it just stay on the cell surface forever?
That's a great question, and the answer is no. The insulin IGF receptor, just like a lot of other cell surface receptors, it undergoes this process called endocytosis.
Endocytosis. That rings a bell. Isn't that when the cell engulfs something from the outside?
Exactly. In this case, the activated receptor, it gets internalized into the cell, forms a vesicle.
So it's like the cell is taking taking the receptor off the stage, giving it a little break.
That's a good analogy. And this internalization, it serves several purposes. It can downregulate receptor signaling by removing receptors from the cell surface.
So it's like turning down the volume on the signal?
Precisely. And it can also, it can also protect the receptor from degradation, and it allows it to be, to be recycled back to the cell surface.
So it's like a maintenance crew,
Yeah.
right? Taking the taking the receptor in for repairs and then putting it back into service.
That's right. And this, this recycling process, it's crucial for maintaining a steady state level of receptors on the cell surface.
Okay, so so the receptor's journey, it doesn't end with activation. It goes through this whole cycle of internalization, recycling, and degradation.
Exactly. And this cycle is tightly regulated
Yeah.
to ensure proper receptor function and signaling.
We've talked a lot about the molecular details of this pathway, but I'm curious about, its role in the bigger picture of human health. What are some of the long-term consequences of dysregulation in this pathway?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, chronic overactivation of the insulin IGF pathway, it's a major contributor to the development of insulin resistance, which is a key feature of type 2 diabetes.
Right, right. We touched on that earlier, but can you maybe elaborate on how how this overactivation actually leads to insulin resistance?
Sure. When the pathway is constantly bombarded with signals,
Yeah.
it can lead to a desensitization of the system. It's like constantly shouting at someone. Eventually, they're just going to tune you out.
So the cells basically become they become numb to the signals from insulin and IGF.
Exactly. And this reduced sensitivity to insulin, it means that glucose can't enter the cells as efficiently, and that leads to high blood sugar levels.
And those chronically high blood sugar levels, that's what causes all the damage that's associated with diabetes.
Precisely. They can damage blood vessels, nerves, all sorts of organs over time, and that can lead to a whole bunch of complications.
Okay, so we've got diabetes. What about the link between this pathway and cancer? How does that play out over the long term?
Well, like we discussed earlier, uncontrolled activation of the insulin IGF pathway, it can promote cell growth and proliferation, and that can increase the risk of cancer development.
Right, those rogue construction crews that we were talking about. But how does that actually lead to cancer in the long run?
Well, it's a multi-step process. This sustained activation of the pathway, it can disrupt the normal cell cycle regulation, and that
Yeah.
can lead to uncontrolled cell division. And over time, those rapidly dividing cells, they can accumulate mutations, and that further increases the risk of cancer.
So it's kind of like a domino effect, right? One problem leads to another, and it ultimately culminates in cancer development.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, and it really it highlights the importance of early intervention and lifestyle modifications to try to prevent chronic diseases like diabetes and cancer.
Okay, so we've got diabetes and cancer. Are there any other long-term consequences of dysregulation in this pathway?
Yeah. Research is also revealing links between dysregulation of this pathway and aging. It seems like chronic activation of this pathway can actually, it can accelerate the aging process.
Wow, that's fascinating. How so?
Well, one theory is that this constant stimulation of growth and metabolism, it can lead to a buildup of cellular damage over time.
So it's like running a machine at full speed all the time. Eventually, it's going to wear out faster.
That's a good analogy.
Right.
And this accelerated aging, it can manifest in all sorts of ways, from increased risk of age-related diseases to premature wrinkles and gray hair.
Okay, so this pathway, it's not just about energy and growth. It's also linked to aging. It really is it's a master regulator of our biology.
It really is, and it's a testament to the interconnectedness of all these systems within our body.
We've been talking about the negative consequences of dysregulation.
Yeah.
But are there any positive effects of activating this pathway?
Oh yeah, there are. Activation of the insulin IGF pathway it's essential for muscle growth and repair.
So this pathway is crucial for athletes and in anyone who wants to build muscle mass.
Absolutely. Resistance exercise, for instance, it activates this pathway, which leads to, which leads to muscle protein synthesis and hypertrophy.
Interesting. So this pathway can be beneficial for building strength and maintaining a healthy body composition.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of balancing activation and inhibition of this pathway, to
Yeah.
achieve optimal health outcomes.
Okay, so it's not just about, shutting down the pathway completely. It's about finding the right balance for our individual needs and goals.
Precisely. And that's where lifestyle modifications, things like diet and exercise, they can play a crucial role in modulating this pathway
Yeah.
and in promoting overall health and well-being.
Now, we've been focusing on the effects of this pathway on individual cells,
Yeah.
but I'm curious about its role in the bigger picture of organismal physiology. Does this pathway, does it influence the function of entire organs or even the whole body?
Oh, absolutely. The insulin IGF pathway, it plays a crucial role in regulating glucose homeostasis throughout the whole body. It coordinates the actions of different organs, like the liver, pancreas, and muscles to ensure that there's a steady supply of glucose to all the cells.
So it's like a conductor, right?
Yeah.
Orchestrating the performance of a whole orchestra of organs.
That's a great analogy. For instance, after a meal, the pancreas releases insulin, and that activates the insulin IGF pathway in various tissues, promoting glucose uptake and storage, and that helps lower blood sugar levels and prevent hyperglycemia.
Okay, so the pancreas is like the lead violinist, right?
Mhm.
Setting the tempo for the rest of the orchestra.
Exactly. And the liver, on the other hand, is like the percussion section.
Yeah.
It plays a key role in glucose production and release.
So this pathway is involved in this delicate dance between glucose storage and release, keeping our blood sugar levels in a healthy range.
Precisely. And when that delicate balance is disrupted, well, it can lead to various metabolic disorders like diabetes.
You mentioned earlier that this pathway is also linked to aging. Can you elaborate on how it influences the aging process at the organismal level?
Sure. Research suggests that the insulin IGF pathway, it plays a role in regulating lifespan and health span in a variety of organisms.
Lifespan and health span. What's the difference between those two?
Well, lifespan is simply how long an organism lives, while health span refers to the period of life during which an organism remains healthy, free from age-related diseases.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So it's not just about living longer, it's about uh, living healthier for longer.
Exactly, and studies have shown that reducing the activity of the insulin IGF pathway can actually, can actually extend both lifespan and health span in various, in various model organisms,
Yeah.
from worms to mice.
Wow, that's incredible. So by tweaking this pathway, we could potentially slow down the aging process and live healthier lives.
That's the hope. And there's growing interest in developing interventions that target this pathway,
Hmm.
to promote longevity and healthy aging in humans.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah.
Seems like this pathway might hold the key to unlocking some of the secrets of aging.
It certainly seems that way, and it really highlights the importance of continued research in this field, to really understand this complex interplay between this pathway, metabolism, and aging.
We've been talking about the insulin IGF pathway in isolation,
Yeah.
but but I'm curious about how it interacts with other hormonal systems in the body. Are there other hormones that influence this pathway
Yeah.
or that are influenced by this pathway?
Yeah, there are. The insulin IGF pathway, it's part of this complex endocrine network that regulates all sorts of physiological processes. For instance, it interacts with the growth hormone IGF-1 axis.
Okay, the growth hormone IGF-1 axis. Remind me what that's all about again.
So growth hormone, which is produced by the pituitary gland in the brain, it stimulates it stimulates the liver to produce IGF-1, and then IGF-1 circulates throughout the body, promoting, promoting growth and development.
Right. So growth hormone is like the CEO,
Right.
right, giving orders to the liver, which is like the factory producing IGF-1.
That's a good analogy. And IGF-1, it can activate the insulin IGF receptor, further further amplifying its effects.
So it's like a positive feedback loop, right? Growth hormone boosts IGF-1,
Right.
which then boosts the activity of the insulin IGF receptor.
Exactly. And this this interplay between these hormones, it's crucial for regulating growth during childhood and adolescence.
Okay, so the insulin IGF pathway, it's not just responding to insulin and IGF, it's also being influenced by growth hormone.
Precisely. And this this highlights the intricate connections between different hormonal systems in the body.
Besides growth hormone, are there any other hormones that interact with this pathway?
Yeah, there are. The insulin IGF pathway is also influenced by sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone.
Interesting. How do those hormones affect this pathway?
Well, estrogen, for instance, it can enhance insulin sensitivity, while testosterone can promote muscle growth, partly through its effects on the insulin IGF pathway.
Okay, so sex hormones, they can either boost or dampen down the activity of this pathway, depending on the specific hormone and the tissue that's involved.
Exactly. And this interplay between sex hormones and the insulin IGF pathway, it's important for.
Okay, so back again and ready to like really get into the nitty-gritty of insulin and IGF receptors. I feel like we've only just, dipped our toes in the water with this system. It's incredibly complex.
Oh yeah, there's always more to learn, That's what makes it so exciting. Every day researchers are finding new things about these receptors, the proteins they interact with, and all the effects they have. It's a really active area of research.
One thing I've been thinking about is this idea of context specificity. We've talked about how these receptors can, activate different pathways depending on the cell type. But I'm wondering how the same signal can trigger different responses even within the same cell, depending on the situation.
That's a really interesting question. It highlights how dynamic cellular signaling really is. It's not just about like which proteins are there. It's also about where they are, how they're interacting, and just the overall state of the cell at that moment.
So it's like you have the same ingredients, but different recipes, right?
Uh-huh.
You can use those ingredients to make, I don't know, something savory or a dessert, depending on how you put them together and what else you add.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And one of the things that makes this context specificity possible is compartmentalization. Remember those microdomains we talked about? Well, it turns out they have a big role in shaping how a cell responds to insulin and IGF.
Okay, those little compartments inside the cell where signaling molecules can hang out, how do those contribute to this idea of context specificity?
Well, by creating these little localized signaling hubs, it's like the cell can customize its response to a particular location or stimulus. For example, insulin might activate the PI3K-AKT pathway in one microdomain, which leads to glucose uptake, but at the same time, it could activate the RAS-AMPK pathway in a different microdomain, and that could lead to cell growth, all happening in the same cell.
So it's kind of like having different rooms in a house, each with its own purpose. You could have a party going on in the living room, but someone's reading quietly in the study all at the same time.
Exactly. And those microdomains, they allow for an amazing level of fine-tuning and coordination of all these different signals. It's really impressive.
Now, we've mainly been talking about the well-known pathways that these receptors activate.
Mm.
But what about like alternative routes? Are there any other signaling pathways, maybe less common ones, that could be involved?
That's a really good point. And actually, yeah, there's a lot of research looking into that right now. It's becoming clearer that these receptors can, they can interact with other signaling pathways in ways we didn't expect. Sometimes it leads to some pretty surprising effects.
So it's like those secret passages and hidden rooms you find in old houses,
Yeah.
right? They connect different parts of the house in ways you wouldn't have guessed.
That's a great way to put it. And some of these less common pathways, they're being investigated for their roles in diseases like cancer and Alzheimer's disease.
Wow, that's really interesting. Can you give me an example of one of these these alternative pathways?
Sure, one example is how the insulin IGF receptor interacts with the want signaling pathway. The want pathway is mostly known for its role in development and determining cell fate, but it's also been linked to cancer.
So it's like those secret passages lead to a whole other part of the house, a part we didn't even know was there.
Exactly. And researchers are still figuring out what this crosstalk between these two pathways really means, but it definitely has implications for both how the body normally works and how diseases develop.
Okay, so we've been thinking about these receptors in individual cells, but what about in the context of tissues and organs? How does the activity of these receptors affect the overall function of a whole system, a group of cells working together?
Well, one way they contribute is by regulating how cells communicate with each other. Cells don't just exist on their own. They're constantly talking to their neighbors, sending and receiving signals back and forth.
So it's like a community, right? Everyone's chatting and catching up.
That's the idea. And the insulin IGF pathway, it's a big part of this communication network. For example, when a cell receives an insulin signal, that can actually influence how the cells around it behave. It's a way to coordinate how they all respond to things like changes in nutrients or other signals from the environment.
Oh, so it's like a neighborhood watch, right? Everyone's looking out for each other.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And that kind of coordinated action, it's super important for keeping tissues healthy and, helping them adapt to different challenges.
You also mentioned that these receptors are involved in development. Can you say more about that? How do they influence the formation of like tissues and organs?
The insulin IGF pathway is essential for regulating how cells grow, multiply, and become specialized. All of those are key processes in development. For example, when an embryo is developing, these receptors help orchestrate the formation of all sorts of organs, from the brain to the limbs. It's a really important role.
So it's like those receptors are the architects, right? They're the ones
Yeah.
drawing up the plans for the developing organism.
Exactly. And even after birth, these receptors still have important jobs in how tissues grow and repair themselves. They're really important for bone growth and muscle development, for example.
Okay, so these receptors are basically essential for building a healthy body from the very beginning.
Precisely. And their activity is really carefully controlled throughout development to make sure everything happens at the right time and in the right place. It's a delicate process.
So we've talked about a lot of, the good things these receptors do, but are there any downsides to having too much activity in this pathway? Are there any risks associated with that?
Yeah, there are some risks. Like we talked about before, if the insulin IGF pathway is overactive for a long time, it can lead to insulin resistance, which is a major factor in developing type 2 diabetes.
Right. But besides diabetes, are there any other potential downsides to this pathway being too active?
Well, some research suggests that too much activity in this pathway might be linked to a higher risk of certain cancers.
Oh, wow. That's concerning. How so?
Remember how we were talking about these receptors and how they encourage cells to grow and divide? Well, if that signal is always on, it can make cells more likely to pick up mutations in their DNA and potentially become cancerous.
So those construction crews we talked about, they're just building and building without any regard for safety or making sure things are done right.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
And this shows how important it is to keep this pathway in balance. We need enough activity to support growth and development, but not so much that it starts causing problems.
Yeah.
It's all about finding the right level.
Yeah, it's like finding that sweet spot, right? Not too much, not too little.
Exactly. And that's where things like diet and exercise can be really powerful. They can help us adjust the activity of this pathway and, really improve our overall health.
Wow, this has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I have a much better understanding of these amazing receptors and how much they influence our bodies.
Yeah.
But before we finish up, I'm curious about what you think the future holds for research in this area. What are some of the big questions that scientists are still trying to answer?
That's a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges is to really grasp just how complex and interconnected these signaling pathways are. We've made a lot of progress in figuring out the main players and how they work together, but there's still a lot we don't know about how they talk to each other and influence each other.
So it's like we've mapped out the main highways, but we're still exploring all the side roads and those little hidden paths.
Exactly. And another big challenge is to take what we know about these pathways and turn that knowledge into effective treatments for diseases. We've had some success, But there's still so much more we can do to help people with diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and so many other conditions.
So there's still a lot to discover and a lot to achieve in this field.
Absolutely. That's what makes it such an exciting area to be working in. There's always something new to learn and always the potential to make a real difference in people's lives.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. This has been a fantastic deep dive into the world of insulin and IGF receptors. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insights with me and our listeners.
It was my pleasure. It's been a great conversation.
To our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey into the amazing world of cellular biology. It really is incredible what's happening inside our bodies every second of every day. And the more we learn, the more we can appreciate the complexity and beauty of life itself. So keep those brains curious, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.